In Bethlehem, Pennsylvania, the winter air tastes of coal and secrets. A gifted seamstress, Agata Kowalski, is summoned to stitch a society bride's trousseau, while the steel heir, Emmett Corbin, returns to announce a future written in iron. One slipped pin, one stolen glance, two lives sewn on opposite sides of the same silk. Beneath chandeliers and soot, a dangerous question shivers. Is the crest on her needle a badge of power, or a warning of what the mills are hiding? Duty stands at the altar. Desire waits at the door. Before we begin, tell me where you're listening from, and answer this. What do you love most in historical romances, forbidden longing, class wars, or hard-won redemption? Bethlehem, Pennsylvania, winter of the year 1885. The air hung with coal soot, and the distant rhythm of steel hammers echoing like a distant heartbeat through the frozen hills. Smoke rose in slow, grey ribbons above the town's towering chimneys, and snow clung to the rooftops like a veil untouched by warmth. In the heart of the working district, tucked behind the narrow alleys where the scent of iron and broth commingled, a seamstress bent her head beneath the yellow glow of an oil lamp. Agata Kowalski sat at her work table, her calloused fingers guiding a needle through ivory muslin as if she were coaxing poetry from fabric. Around her, bolts of cloth rested like sleeping bodies, dove-grey taffeta, pale rose silk, and the luminous cream satin reserved for the train of the Corbin wedding gown. Each stitch she placed was silent, precise, and invisible, much like her place in the world. The daughter of a Polish foundry worker, Agata had learned early that dignity was not given, but earned in silence and in thread. The Corbins had sent for her just after the New Year's frost, when their usual dressmaker in Philadelphia fell ill. It was said that Lydia Corbin demanded nothing short of Parisian elegance for her upcoming wedding. Fabrics imported from Lyon, lace from Chantilly, gloves no one in Bethlehem could pronounce. Yet it was Agata who had been chosen to bring those impossible visions to life. She worked not in a salon, but in a drafty room above a boarding house, her window glazed with ice. Still, her needle was faster than any girl's in the city, and her sketches, done in charcoal between cups of weak tea, had a quiet brilliance that none could deny. On the morning she was summoned to the Corbin estate for final measurements, the wind bit at her shawl and rattled the tramcar that carried her up the hillside. The Corbin mansion loomed like a fortress above the town, a pale stone beast with arched windows and a fountain long frozen over. Servants ushered her into a receiving room the size of the entire boarding house floor. Its wallpaper gleamed gold beneath chandeliers, and the faint scent of lilies, shipped weekly from New York, perfumed the air as if it, too, belonged to another class. Lydia Corbin stood by the window, her pale blonde hair arranged in sculpted curls that defied both time and weather. She was tall, elegant, and perfectly still, like a painted portrait come to life. She did not smile when Agata entered, but gestured toward the mannequin that wore the first mock-up of her wedding bodice. "I want more volume at the shoulder," Lydia said, inspecting the garment as if she were studying a business contract, "and less pleating at the waist. It must be fashionable, not frumpy." Agata nodded, her eyes already noting the adjustments needed. "Yes, Miss Corbin. May I?" Lydia turned slightly, allowing Agata to step behind her and begin measuring the slope of her back, the narrowness of her waist, the drape of the fabric. Her fingers moved with practiced grace, yet her thoughts were far from her needle. She was listening, always listening, to the silence between commands, the slight rustle of Lydia's silk slippers, the muted ticking of the wall clock. It was in moments like these that Agata felt herself vanish, as if she were only the hands and never the heart behind the gown. Then the door opened. She heard it before she saw him, the soft creak of leather boots on the polished floor, the subtle clearing of a throat not meant to interrupt, but to enter with purpose. And when Agata looked up, her world shifted in a way she could not name. Emmett Corbin stood in the doorway, tall and composed, in a dark wool coat still dusted with snow, his eyes, steel grey and unyielding, swept across the room and landed not on Lydia, but on Agata, just for a moment. A flicker, and then the air changed. "Apologies," he said, his voice low and clear. "I didn't realize there was a fitting in progress." Lydia turned toward him with a practiced smile. "You're early. That's unlike you." "I thought I might say hello before meeting with Father," he replied, stepping inside. His gaze did not return to Agata, but she felt the residue of it, like a hand that had almost touched her cheek. She lowered her eyes at once and resumed pinning the bodice's side seam. Her hands were steady, but something in her breath faltered. She could smell the cold on his coat, the faint trace of tobacco and something else, metal perhaps, or smoke. It clung to him like memory. Lydia, ever attuned to the currents in a room, narrowed her eyes slightly. "This is Agata Kowalski. She's been sewing the gowns." "Has she?" Emmett said, his tone unreadable. He stepped closer, studying the mannequin as Agata pinned the fabric into place. "Impressive work." "Functional," Lydia corrected. "It will be beautiful once it's properly tailored." Agata said nothing. She never did when rich people spoke about her as if she were not in the room. But then the unthinkable happened. A pin slipped from her fingers, just one, but it pricked Lydia's arm as it fell. Lydia let out a sharp gasp and stepped back, her gloved hand flying to the spot. "You pricked me!" she exclaimed. Agata's cheeks flamed. "I'm so sorry, Miss Corbin. Let me—" But before she could reach for the fallen pin, Emmett had already stooped and picked it up. He extended it toward Agata, his hands steady, his eyes on hers. "It happens," he said softly. "Even the best hands bleed sometimes." Agata took the pin without touching his skin, but something passed between them, brief as a breath. A spark without fire, a silence charged with something dangerously human. Lydia watched them both. She did not speak. "Perhaps we'll resume tomorrow," she said coldly. "I've lost the mood." Agata gathered her things, her hands trembling ever so slightly as she folded the measuring tape into her apron. She curtsied and turned to leave, her boots soundless on the rug. As she passed Emmett, he stepped aside, but not entirely. Their shoulders nearly touched. "Good day, Miss Kowalski," he said. She did not look up, but her voice, when it came, was clear. "Good day, Mr. Corbin." Outside, the wind bit at her cheeks as she descended the hill. Behind her, the mansion faded into the white sky like a dream she had no right to remember. But still, she carried it with her, the warmth of a glance, the weight of a pin, the sound of her name spoken without condescension. She had stitched dresses for weddings she would never attend, woven beauty into gowns for women who never saw her. But for the first time, someone had looked, not at the thread, but at the hands that held it. And that, Agata knew, was far more dangerous than a dropped pin. Bethlehem, Pennsylvania wore its winter like a burden of ash. The snow no longer fell fresh and white, but settled in grey layers that clung to rooftops and window panes, stained by the endless smoke from the furnaces. The Corbin mills never slept. Even in the dead of night, the sky glowed faintly orange from the flames licking the skyline. The sound of metal on metal, the groan of machinery, the clang of hammers, the whistle of steam, formed the music of survival for the working class. It was a music Agata Kowalski knew by heart. The boarding house at the edge of the mill district had no silk curtains or marble fireplaces, but it had a hearth that burned with stubborn perseverance and walls that breathed warmth despite their cracks. In the smallest upstairs room, Agata sat on a stool by the bed, her needle forgotten in her lap. Her father coughed, a sound that came in long, racking waves that left him gasping for breath and clutching the worn blanket pulled up to his chest. He had been a strong man once, broad-shouldered, capable, with hands blackened by honest work and a laugh that filled the room. But the years in the foundry had eaten away at his lungs, and now he coughed as though the furnace had taken root inside him. His eyes, once sharp and warm, now fluttered with fatigue. "You should sleep," she whispered, smoothing the thin edge of the blanket near his shoulder. "I'm not cold." he rasped, voice rough, like the scraping of coal on brick. "Just tired. Don't fuss over me, Agata." "I'm not fussing," she murmured, brushing a hand across his forehead. "Just watching." Outside, the wind howled low, rattling the shutters. Rent was due in 4 days. The medicine had cost more than she could afford. Her sewing for the Corbins, though generous compared to the usual mending work, would not stretch far enough. There were mouths to feed in the boarding house too, neighbours who often traded a pot of stew for a patched hem, but who now had little to share themselves. The next morning she rose before the sun and made her way through the frost-bitten streets toward the mill. Her boots left faint impressions in the snow, and her shawl was wrapped tightly around her shoulders, pinned at the throat with a crooked brooch, an old one that had once belonged to her mother. In her satchel were 2 coats, one belonging to a foreman whose sleeve had torn near the seam, the other to a boy, barely 17, burnt along the cuff from working too close to an unguarded pipe. She waited at the gate with the others, wives, sisters, children, each one bearing small tokens for the men within, a wrapped loaf, a letter, a pair of mended gloves. When the whistle blew and the shift ended, the workers poured out in tired silence, their faces smudged with soot, eyes glassy from exhaustion. Agata passed the coats into grateful hands and took 2 more in return. No one asked for prices. They paid what they could, or not at all. That evening, while pressing a seam by the warmth of the stove, a sharp knock startled her from her thoughts. She opened the door to find a young servant boy, no more than 13, dressed in the Corbin livery, his cheeks flushed from the cold. "Miss Kowalski," he asked, clutching a folded paper, "Miss Lydia says you're to come tomorrow with the revised sketch, and—" He hesitated, lowering his voice. "And she says don't forget to bring the lace samples." Agata thanked him and closed the door gently. She turned the paper in her hands. Lydia's handwriting was impeccable, the ink dark and fine. There were notes scribbled in the margins, demands for narrower sleeves, tighter pleats, more embellishment. Each line was a reminder of a world where expectations came draped in tulle and disregard. She spent the night working by lamplight, her fingers tracing new lines on parchment, adjusting curves, recalculating the proportions Lydia required. The lace samples were wrapped in muslin and tied with a ribbon before dawn. Her father, still sleeping, stirred only once. She left a cup of hot broth and a note by his bedside. At the Corbin estate, the marble entrance hall echoed beneath her steps. The butler led her not to the fitting room, but through a side corridor and into a drawing room where the fire crackled quietly and cream-coloured armchairs lined the wall. She waited alone, the sketches and lace in her lap, her hands folded to keep from trembling. Emmett Corbin entered without ceremony. He had removed his coat, revealing a wool vest flecked with ash, and the rolled sleeves of a linen shirt still creased from the day's labour. His hair was damp at the temples, and a smear of soot stained the cuff of his left wrist. He looked like a man who had wrestled the mills and only just stepped away. "You're early," he said, walking to the hearth. He did not look at her when he spoke, but his voice carried warmth beneath its fatigue. "I was asked to bring the new sketch," she replied, rising to hand it to him. "Miss Lydia wasn't specific about where to wait." He accepted the page and studied it with a faint furrow between his brows. "You adjusted the neckline." She wanted a narrower fit. The previous angle didn't flatter her posture. "She won't like hearing that." "I won't tell her if you don't." A smile tugged at the corner of his mouth, just enough to soften the sharp line of his jaw. He glanced at her, really looked, for the first time that morning. The light from the fire caught in her eyes, warming the gold in their depths. "You see more than people give you credit for, Miss Kowalski." She said nothing, but her silence was not submission. It was power contained, measured, deliberate. Emmett folded the sketch and set it on the mantel. "I went to the northern floor of the furnace this week," he said suddenly. "Someone nearly lost a hand to a cracked valve." Agata's fingers tightened slightly at her sides. "I recommended repairs, new equipment even, weeks ago. My father dismissed the idea. He ran a hand through his hair, frustration sharp in the gesture. Says it slows production, says men are paid to risk. They are paid to survive, she said, her voice calm but firm. He turned to her. Their eyes met. And there, in the quiet hush of the drawing room, with lace samples still clutched in her hand, something unspoken passed between them. Not affection, too early. Not longing, too dangerous, but understanding. And that, in a world drawn along sharp lines of wealth and labor, was far more powerful. I walked past your boarding house once, he said. Late. There was a girl sitting on the steps mending a doll's dress by moonlight. That was Rafaela. She lost her mother in the spring. I offered to teach her stitches. It calms the hands. It calms the heart too, I think, he murmured. A knock broke the moment. The butler entered with word that Miss Lydia was ready for her fitting upstairs. Agata gathered her sketches, dipped her head in a respectful nod, and turned to go. As she reached the door, Emmett spoke again, low but certain. Thank you, Miss Kowalski, for reminding me of what matters. She paused just for a breath. Then she stepped out into the hall without replying. Outside, the sky had darkened, and snow began to fall once more. Coal dust clung to the edges of the wind, but beneath it, the faintest whisper of something else stirred in the air. It was not hope, not yet, but it was the beginning of something that could not be stitched away. Bethlehem, Pennsylvania, trembled beneath a sky the color of molten steel. The winter sun had not yet risen when the first scream split the morning, sharp, human, and swallowed almost instantly by the roar of the furnaces. The sound carried through the valley, seeping into every street and alleyway, until even the birds fled from the smoke. At the Corbin mill, the shift had begun before dawn, as it always did, but on that day something broke. A valve, a line, a silence too long ignored. Emmett Corbin was on the floor when it happened. The hiss of steam turned into a scream of pressure, then a blast that shook the walls. Men scattered. Sparks showered down like a storm of red snow. The heat was unbearable, the stench of oil and burning cloth thick enough to choke. He shouted orders, cut the gas line, pull the injured clear, but his voice was one among hundreds. He tore his coat from his shoulders and used it to smother a man's sleeve that had caught fire. Someone fell. Someone cried out a prayer. Then the furnace coughed its last, and everything went still. When the smoke cleared, 3 men lay on the ground. One of them was Tomasz Lewandowski, a wiry foundryman with a laugh that could shake the rafters, and a daughter who sold flowers near the station. Emmett knelt beside him, pressing a handkerchief to the wound on his arm, which gleamed raw and blistered. Tomasz looked up at him through the haze and managed a weak grin. "I told them," he rasped. "Told them that pipe was singing." Emmett's heart clenched. "I know, I heard it too." Behind him the foreman shouted for order, but the workers had already gathered in a silent circle, faces black with soot and fear. The injured were carried out on stretchers, 2 breathing, 1 not. The youngest, a boy barely 16, did not stir when they lifted him. By noon, the snow outside the mill was grey with ash. That same morning, in the Kowalski boarding house, Agata sat by the window with her mending basket. Her father slept in his chair, his breathing shallow. The steady rhythm of her needle soothed her thoughts until the door burst open. A neighbor's son, his face streaked with soot and panic, stood gasping in the threshold. "There was a fire," he blurted. "At the Corbin mill. Tomasz is hurt. Badly." Agata rose so fast the stool toppled. The fabric slid from her lap. "Tomasz Lewandowski?" He nodded. "They took him to the infirmary near the river." She threw on her shawl and was gone before her father could call her name. The walk to the infirmary was long and bitter, the wind slicing through her clothes like blades. When she arrived, the smell of burnt flesh met her before she even crossed the door. Inside, cots lined the walls, men moaning softly, hands bandaged, eyes glazed. The doctor, overworked and grim, moved between them like a ghost in a blood-stained apron. Agata found Tomasz near the back. His arm was wrapped from wrist to shoulder, his face pale and glistening with sweat. When she touched his hand, he stirred. "Ah, Agatka," he whispered. "I told them the pipe was singing." She felt tears sting her eyes. They didn't listen? He gave a small, bitter laugh. They never do, not until it's too late. Her gaze shifted to the window, where the chimneys still smoked against the white sky. She thought of Emmett Corbin, the man with the steady voice, the thoughtful eyes. She had seen him near those very furnaces, his hands stained with the same soot. Could he have turned away? Could he have known? When she returned home, her father listened in silence as she told him of the fire. His brow furrowed, but his words were calm. "Don't speak of it outside these walls," he said. "The Corbins have long ears. But people should know. Tomasz could have died. People will know," he said softly. "And then they'll forget. That's how it works here." Agata said nothing, but her silence burned hotter than the furnace ever had. 3 nights later, she was summoned again to the Corbin estate for a fitting. Lydia's wedding preparations had resumed, unshaken by the tragedy. The grand salon was warm and perfumed, its fire casting golden light over the silk and lace draped across every surface. Lydia stood before a mirror, her pale gown gleaming like the surface of a pearl. Agata worked quietly at her hem, her needle moving with mechanical grace. "Have you heard the news?" Lydia asked, inspecting herself from every angle. "A fire at the mill. Terrible business. But they say it was contained." Agata kept her eyes on the fabric. 3 men were injured. So few. Then it was hardly a disaster. Lydia adjusted a diamond pin in her hair. "Emmett handled it, of course. Father says he's quite determined to be a hero." Agata's throat tightened. She pricked her finger, and a drop of blood stained the white satin. She turned quickly, dabbing it with a scrap of cloth before Lydia noticed. When the fitting ended, Lydia dismissed her with a wave, complaining about the veil's length. Agata packed her tools and descended the marble stairs, her pulse still unsteady. In the corridor ahead, she saw Emmett standing by the doorway to his father's study. His coat was unbuttoned, his face pale. Henrik Corbin's voice carried through the closed door, sharp, commanding, and merciless. "I won't have rumors about negligence," Henrik barked. "You'll keep this quiet. The men will be compensated. Their families will sign the papers." "Father," Emmett's voice broke through, restrained but heavy with anger. "They deserve better than hush money. They deserve their wages, nothing more. The company is not a charity. You will do as you're told." A long silence followed. Then the door opened and Henrik emerged, a tall shadow in black wool, eyes like shards of ice. He passed Agata without acknowledging her presence. Emmett stepped into the hall, shoulders rigid. When he saw her, his expression changed. "Miss Kowalski." She bowed her head slightly. "Mr. Corbin." Her voice was cold, polite. He hesitated, searching for something to say, but she turned toward the exit. "I heard about the fire," she said quietly. "I was at the infirmary." He froze. "You shouldn't have gone there." "Shouldn't I?" Her tone sharpened. "Someone had to." His jaw tightened. "I did what I could." "Did you?" She faced him fully now, her eyes fierce, glinting beneath the flicker of the chandelier. "Because they're saying the company paid for silence instead of truth." He stepped closer, his voice lowering. "That wasn't my decision. But you stood there while it happened." "I stood there," he said, the words torn from him, "because I was trying to stop it." The weight of his admission hung between them. His face was shadowed, the firelight drawing deep lines around his eyes. For the first time, Agata saw something beneath the calm veneer, a man torn between loyalty and conscience. "They'll replace the broken line," he went on. "I've ordered new valves, safer ones. My father disagrees, but I'll find a way." Her anger faltered. "The men don't believe anyone cares." "I do." His voice was quiet now, the kind that carried truth because it didn't need to shout. "You must believe that." For a moment, The hallway seemed to shrink around them, the scent of coal and candle wax, the sound of the wind pressing against the windows. It all faded into stillness. Agata looked at him, at the exhaustion written across his face, and something inside her shifted. She wanted to hold on to her anger, but it softened, unwillingly. "Then tell them," she whispered. "Tell them yourself." "I will." He met her gaze, steady, unwavering. "If you'll still believe me when I do." She opened her mouth to reply, but a servant's footsteps broke the moment. Emmett straightened, stepping back, his composure snapping back into place. "Good night, Miss Kowalski," he said. She curtsied without a word and left through the servants' entrance. Outside, the snow was falling again, melting as it touched the black stone of the steps. She pulled her shawl tighter, her breath clouding in the cold air. Behind her, the mansion's lights glowed like embers in the dark. That night, as she returned to the boarding house, she passed the mills once more. The furnaces hissed softly in the distance, their glow reflected in the Lehigh River like ribbons of fire. She paused, watching the smoke rise toward the heavens, where it vanished into nothing. Somewhere inside that inferno, she thought, truth was struggling to breathe, and though she did not yet know it, so was her heart. The wind that swept through Bethlehem in the final weeks of January carried a sharper edge than usual. It hissed through the narrow streets, rattled the shutters, and scraped at the windows as if trying to enter the homes of the working class. The Corbin mansion, high on its hill, stood untouched by such intrusions. Its chimneys exhaled smooth white smoke, and its grand iron gates glittered with frost beneath the lamplight. Inside, the fire burned high, perfuming the air with cedar and wealth. Lydia Corbin sat before her dressing mirror, her expression poised but hardening at the edges. On the vanity before her lay a half-folded letter, one that bore her fiancé's seal, but not his sentiment. She had read it 3 times already, her delicate gloved finger tracing the short, impersonal lines written in Emmett's careful hand. Delayed again at the mills, inspecting the lower furnaces. No tender phrases, no mention of her new gown, no promise of dinner at the club, just business. Always business. Her maid, a timid girl named Elsie, hovered behind her, smoothing the folds of Lydia's silken bodice. "Shall I prepare the carriage for your errands, miss?" Lydia's reflection met the girl's eyes through the mirror, sharp and cold. "No, not yet." She rose from the chair in one elegant motion, her skirts whispering against the carpet. "Tell me, Elsie, do you know where the boarding house district is?" The maid hesitated. "Near the river, miss." "Past the church and the Foundry Road?" Lydia's tone darkened like a cloud crossing the sun. "Then tomorrow morning you'll go there. I want you to ask around. There's a woman, a seamstress. Her name is Agata Kowalski." Elsie's eyes widened. "The one who makes your gowns, miss?" "The very same," Lydia replied, "but don't be a fool. You're not to mention my name, just listen. See what sort of people she keeps company with." The maid curtsied, uneasy. "Yes, miss." When she left, Lydia stood alone by the window. Outside, snow was falling in slow, deliberate flakes, each one reflecting the candlelight. She pressed her palm to the glass. "A seamstress," she whispered to her reflection, "and he goes there more than he comes here." In the lower part of town, the boarding house was alive with the evening rhythm of survival. Someone played a fiddle near the stove. Children ran up and down the hall, carrying bread crusts wrapped in paper. The smell of boiled cabbage and soap filled the narrow stairwell. Agata sat near the window, mending a torn cuff for one of the mill men, the dim glow of a kerosene lamp haloing her profile. The day's exhaustion had settled in her bones, but she refused to stop working. The rent was due soon, and her father's medicine was nearly gone. Her fingers moved automatically, following the rhythm of the needle and the soft hiss of fabric. Outside, the first snow began to drift again, muffling the distant sounds of the mills. A soft knock interrupted her concentration. When she opened the door, her neighbour Mrs. Whitcomb stood there, clutching a basket filled with damp linen. "Agata, my dear," the older woman said breathlessly. Would you be an angel and help me finish these before morning? My hands ache something awful." And Agata smiled faintly and took the basket. "Of course. Sit by the fire and warm yourself. I'll see to them tonight." "You work too hard," Mrs. Whitcomb said, shaking her head. "You'll wear yourself down to bone and thread." "I'm still standing," Agata murmured, but her smile didn't reach her eyes. The next morning, gossip began its slow, poisonous crawl through the marketplace. A young maid had been seen asking questions about a Polish seamstress near the river. Whispers followed the maid, then the whispers grew tails and wings. By noon, the butcher's wife told the baker's sister that the seamstress had been seen walking arm in arm with a gentleman after dark. By evening, the rumour had become sharper, more colourful, more cruel. "A man from the Corbin family," someone said. "The one who owns the mills." "No, no," another countered. "It's the young heir himself." Agata heard the murmurs at the tailor's shop when she went to buy thread. Two women at the counter fell silent the moment she entered. One of them gave a knowing smile and whispered into the other's ear. She paid quickly and left, her pulse pounding in her throat. Outside, the air was cold enough to burn. She pulled her shawl tighter, ignoring the way people's eyes seemed to linger longer than usual. At the Corbin estate, Emmett stood in his father's office, but his thoughts were elsewhere. Henrik droned on about iron shipments and labour contracts, but Emmett's gaze wandered toward the frost-coated window, where smoke from the chimneys blurred the horizon. When the meeting ended, he caught sight of Lydia gliding down the hall, her gown gleaming like snowlight. She stopped when she saw him, her expression composed but her eyes sharp. "You've been busy," she said, her tone light but edged. "There's been much to repair," he replied. "Yes, I'm sure the furnaces are terribly interesting." Her smile did not reach her eyes. "Almost as interesting as a certain seamstress near the river, I hear." He froze, his blood turning to ice. "Who told you that?" "Oh, it doesn't matter who. It's a small town, Emmett. News travels faster than coal dust." She stepped closer, her perfume sweet but suffocating. "I would hope you remember your name, even among simpler company." He exhaled slowly. "Whatever you've heard, Lydia, it isn't true." She tilted her head, studying him like a specimen under glass. "Then you won't mind if I ask my maid to continue her inquiries?" He met her gaze. "You already have." She faltered just a moment, then smiled again, a brittle, dangerous curve of her lips. "I suppose I have." He bowed slightly, as if ending a waltz, and walked away before she could say another word. That evening, as the streets darkened, Emmett made his way down to the river road. Snow fell thick and quiet, softening the edges of the world. He pulled his coat tighter and kept his head low, aware that every shadow could be a pair of watching eyes. The boarding-house lights glowed dimly in the distance, and smoke rose from its chimney like a humble prayer. He found Agata outside, standing on the steps with a basket of freshly folded linen in her arms. Her shawl was dusted with snow, her cheeks flushed from the cold. "Miss Kowalski," he said, his voice low but clear. She turned sharply, startled. "Mr. Corbin." Her tone was polite but distant. "I came to warn you," he began, stepping closer. "There are rumours, false ones, circulating about you." "I've heard," she said evenly. "They're just words. They'll pass." "Not when they concern me," he replied. "Lydia, my fiancée, she's the one who started them." Agata stiffened, her hands tightening on the basket's handle. "Then you should tell her the truth. Tell her you pity the poor seamstress, that you speak to her only because she reminds you of what's broken in your mills." "That's not why," he said quietly. "You know that's not why." Her gaze met his, defiant and shimmering in the lamplight. "I know nothing of you, Mr. Corbin, and I prefer it that way." He flinched, but only slightly. For a moment they stood in silence as the snow fell heavier, settling on his shoulders, her hair, the basket between them. Somewhere down the road, a church bell tolled. Then Agata sighed and shifted the basket. "I have to go. Mrs. Whitcomb's husband died last year. She can't carry laundry in this cold." "Let me come with you," he said before thinking. "It's late." The roads are— I've walked them all my life, she interrupted. You'd ruin your boots. Still he followed, not beside her at first, but behind, his steps careful and steady. When the wind picked up, he caught up to her and offered his coat. Please, he said simply. She hesitated, then accepted it, draping it over her shoulders without meeting his eyes. The warmth of the wool enveloped her, still carrying his scent. Wood smoke, ink, something faintly metallic. They walked in silence through the snow. Their breaths mingled in the cold air, rising in fragile clouds. There was no need for words. The only sound was the crunch of their steps and the soft rustle of the fabric when she adjusted the coat around her. When they reached Mrs. Whitcomb's door, the widow appeared with a lantern, her face lined but kind. "Oh, child, you shouldn't be out this late," she scolded gently, taking the basket. Her eyes flicked to Emmett, curiosity glinting. "And who's this fine gentleman?" Agata lowered her gaze. "Just someone passing by." Emmett tipped his hat. "A friend," he said. Mrs. Whitcomb smiled faintly, then disappeared inside. Agata turned back to him, the lantern's glow flickering between them. "You shouldn't have followed me," she whispered. "I couldn't let you walk alone," he replied. "I've never had anyone walk beside me," she said softly, "and I've managed." Her words lingered in the air, fragile as snowflakes. She handed him his coat, their fingers brushing for the briefest moment. It was nothing, a touch, a spark, but it felt like the world holding its breath. "Good night, Mr. Corbin." "Good night, Miss Kowalski." She walked away without looking back. He stood there, watching her disappear into the pale curtain of snow until only her shadow remained, small, solitary, but unbroken. And when he finally turned toward the road, he realized that the cold no longer touched him. The snow had begun to melt in Bethlehem, but only just. Streets remained choked with grey slush, and the rooftops shimmered with the last, stubborn traces of winter. It was late February, and yet the town carried itself with a heaviness that had little to do with the weather. The mills still thundered day and night, but there was a tightness in the air, as if something unseen had begun to fracture, silently, beneath the weight of industry and expectation. Inside the Corbin mansion, however, the mood was entirely different. Preparations for Lydia's engagement ball had overtaken every inch of the house. Footmen polished silver until their fingers blistered. Florists arrived in carriages bearing hothouse orchids and roses imported from Savannah. Musicians rehearsed waltzes in the drawing room beneath the chandelier. Lydia wanted a spectacle, a performance to distract from the rumors, the fire, the whispers clinging to her fiancé's name like coal dust. And above all, she wanted a gown that would silence every tongue in the city. The request came by letter, written in Lydia's impeccable script, delivered by the house steward with a sealed envelope and no eye contact. Inside was a single line: "Embroider the Corbin crest across the bodice, prominently." Agata stared at the page for a long time before folding it in half and placing it beneath a stack of uncut muslin. The room around her was quiet. Her father dozed by the fire, and the only sound was the rhythmic tick of the wall clock. She stood slowly and walked to the window. Outside, the sky had turned the color of iron. Smoke curled above the mills like questions no one dared ask. The Corbin crest. It was a phoenix wrapped in a ribbon of steel, its wings spread wide, claws gripping a hammer and a flame. It had been carved into the gates of the estate, stitched into waistcoats, painted onto carriages, engraved into the pocket watches gifted to favored sons. It was power made visible, wealth cloaked in myth. And now she was to sew it into silk. At the mill, Emmett Corbin walked the length of the northern floor, his boots echoing across the metal grates. The men moved around him with nods of recognition, their eyes watchful but respectful. Since the fire, he had made a point to be present. Daily inspections, unannounced visits, quiet conversations in corners where no one could hear. He had ordered new valves, commissioned safety upgrades, doubled rest shifts. But none of it was enough. The cost of change, he was beginning to understand, was measured not in coin, but in blood and silence. He found his father in the upper office, standing at the window with a tumbler of dark bourbon in one hand and a ledger in the other. Emmett Corbin turned as Emmett entered, his expression unreadable. "You're early," the older man said. Emmett closed the door behind him. "We need to talk." Henrik raised a brow. "About the ball, I assume? Lydia's decorators are already bleeding us dry." "Not the ball," Emmett said, stepping forward. "The foundry, the southern floor." Henrik set the glass down. "What about it?" "I want it shut down until the ventilation system is replaced." His father's eyes narrowed. "You don't shut down a floor that yields 12,000 tons a week. Are you out of your mind? I'm trying to prevent another fire." Henrik crossed the room with slow, deliberate steps, stopping just short of his son. "Do you know how many cities depend on our output? Rail lines, warships, bridges, one delay ripples through half the nation. The weight of that responsibility is not a child's toy." "I am not a child," Emmett said quietly. "No," Henrik replied, his voice suddenly cold. "You're a man who's become infatuated with a girl who stitches hems in a wooden room that leaks in the rain." The words struck with the precision of a blade. Emmett's jaw clenched, but he didn't look away. "You've always had a soft heart," Henrik went on. "I hoped time would harden it into something useful, but now you're risking everything. The name, the future, her safety." Emmett flinched. "Don't threaten her." "It's not a threat. It's a reality. Do you think society will welcome her? Do you think the board will sit quietly while their heir dances with a scandal?" He leaned in, voice lowering. "If she means anything to you, you'll protect her by letting her go." Emmett looked at the window. The chimneys outside smoked like volcanoes, indifferent and endless. "If you continue down this path," Henrik said, "you will lose everything, and so will she." Emmett left without another word. That evening, Agata laid out the dress fabric on her table. The gown was an opalescent ivory, delicate as frost and softer than cloud. She touched the fabric with reverence, then with resentment. Her needle hovered above the bodice. The chalk lines of the crest were already marked. Lydia had insisted on prominence, which meant it would sit just below the collarbone, gleaming like a badge of conquest. Her hands moved, despite herself. The first thread was gold, fine and strong. She pierced the silk. The phoenix began to take shape. She worked late into the night, the oil lamp casting warm light across her face. Her fingers were steady, but her thoughts tangled. Each stitch was a surrender, each thread a chain. But there was no choice. If she refused, she would lose the commission. If she protested, she would be dismissed. If she spoke too boldly, there were ears in the streets now, eager to brand her ungrateful, insolent, unworthy. So she stitched in silence, with fury. When her father stirred from sleep, he found her still at the table, her posture rigid. "Agata," he murmured, "you must rest." "I'm finishing the crest," she said without looking up. He sat beside her and watched the shape grow, wing by wing, flame by flame. After a while, he placed a trembling hand over hers. "You're stronger than your mother," he said. "She would have cried at this." "I want to cry," Agata whispered, "but I'm too tired." He kissed her knuckles gently. "Then let me cry for you." The next morning, Agata arrived at the Corbin estate with the bodice wrapped in linen and her expression unreadable. Lydia greeted her in the ballroom, where a flurry of decorators arranged flowers and lanterns, as if building a temple to vanity. The bride-to-be stood beneath the central chandelier, arms outstretched, her gown floating like mist. Agata approached and unfolded the bodice. Lydia gasped. "Oh, it's exquisite!" She ran her fingers over the embroidered phoenix, eyes alight with approval. "See how it shines. The guests will see it from across the room. They'll never forget." Agata said nothing. "Are you crying?" Lydia asked, noticing her damp lashes. "No," Agata replied softly, "just tired." Later that day, Emmett returned from the mill, his shoulders heavy beneath the weight of 100 decisions he could not make alone. He entered the drawing room just as Agata was leaving. Their eyes met in the doorway. She paused. "Your father came to see me yesterday." Emmett's breath caught. "What did he say?" She didn't answer. Instead, she reached into her satchel and handed him a small swatch of fabric, the piece she had trimmed from the bodice lining. The edges were frayed. "I stitched it," she said. "The crest. I did it because I had to." "I know, but it hurt." He looked at her, searching for words, but none were enough. "I don't need your protection," she added, "just your honesty." Then she turned and walked away, leaving him with the cloth and the silence. And though the phoenix on that bodice would rise for Lydia's glory, it was Agata's quiet sorrow that gave it life. A truth stitched in thread, burning brighter than fire. The morning light in Bethlehem was pale and filtered through a sky bleached of colour, the sun barely managing to cast a shadow. Along the narrow streets near the river, chimneys still smoked from early fires and the scent of bread mingled with coal dust. Winter lingered like an unwelcome guest, reluctant to leave, and the town moved slowly beneath its weight. In the modest upper room of the boarding house, Agata Kowalski worked with the quiet intensity of a woman who had long ago learned that purpose could silence pain. She was seated by the window, hemming a veil of French lace so delicate it seemed made of frost. The fine fabric shimmered with each movement of her needle, a shimmer that stood in cruel contrast to the turmoil beneath her still expression. The veil was for Lydia Corbin, and Agata had stitched it in silence. Her father had not yet risen. He had slept poorly, coughing through the night, and now dozed in his chair, a blanket tucked beneath his chin. Agata reached for another pin, her fingers brushing the wooden tray, when a knock sounded at the door. It was soft, 2 taps and a pause. She looked up, surprised. Visitors came rarely and never at that hour. When she opened the door, Mrs. Whitcomb stood on the landing. Her cheeks were flushed from the cold, her shawl drawn tightly around her narrow shoulders. The lines on her face, deepened by grief, looked sharper than usual. "Forgive me for coming unannounced," the widow said gently, "but I have something that belongs to you." Agata stepped aside and motioned her in. "Of course, please come in from the cold." Mrs. Whitcomb hesitated, then crossed the threshold, her boots leaving damp prints on the floor. She did not remove her shawl. Her eyes moved to Agata's father, still sleeping, then back to her. "I found this in my husband's coat," she said, reaching into her satchel. "He must have written it the night before he died." From her worn leather bag, she withdrew a folded envelope, yellowed, creased, the name Agata written in an uneven hand. Agata took it, her throat tight. "I don't understand." "Why would he—" "He trusted you," the widow said softly. "He told me once that you had a good eye, that you saw things others ignored." She hesitated, then added, "He mentioned something about the valve, about what he had reported." Agata stared down at the letter, then slowly opened it. The note inside was short, written in laborious, crooked script. "To whoever will listen, the valve on Furnace 4 is cracked. I told the supervisor 3 times. He said the Corbins know, but won't replace it. Said it's cheaper to keep the heat running than to fix what's broken. If anything happens to me, someone must tell the truth. Signed, T. Whitcomb." Agata's hands trembled. The words bled through the page like bruises. Proof. Undeniable, terrifying proof. "I don't know what to do with it," she whispered. Mrs. Whitcomb touched her arm. "It won't bring him back, but maybe it will stop the next widow from knocking on your door." She turned to go, then paused. "Be careful, child. Truth can be heavy, especially when powerful men want to bury it." When the door closed behind her, Agata stood motionless, the letter still in her hand. Outside, the bells of St. Michael's tolled 11 times. Emmett arrived at the boarding house later that afternoon, his coat dusted with ash, his boots marked by the wet, thawing streets. He had not sent word. He had not dared. When Agata opened the door and saw him standing there, her eyes filled with something unreadable, neither welcome nor rejection, but something far deeper, something like war. "I have to speak with you," he said quietly. "Please." She stepped aside without a word. He entered and removed his gloves, his eyes drawn to the folded paper she held in her hands. "I know," he said before she could speak. "You have it." She looked at him, her voice steady but cold. "Then you know what your father did." He nodded, his jaw tight. "I suspected, but this is proof." "You suspected," she repeated, the words bitter on her tongue. "And yet you let me stitch your family's crest while the men who made your fortune bled in the dark." "That's not fair," he said too quickly. "I tried to fight him. I've ordered changes." "And how many more have to burn before changes arrive?" she asked. "How many more daughters will bury their fathers while you sign orders that never reach the floor?" He stepped forward. "Let me take the letter. Let me present it. I'll go to the board, to the press if I must. My name has weight." "So does mine," she cut in, "even if only in whispers." He paused, his chest rising with the effort of restraint. "If you bring it forward, they'll crush you. They'll call you bitter, a woman scorned. They'll turn you into a liar." Her eyes glistened, but she didn't blink. "Then let them." He took another step. "I can protect you." She shook her head. "You can't. Not from them, and not from her." The words fell heavy between them. Emmett closed his eyes briefly. "Lydia knows, doesn't she?" "She suspects," Agata replied, "and suspicion is more dangerous than truth. It leaves room for imagination." There was a long silence. Outside, the sky had begun to darken, and the wind carried the scent of rain over melting snow. "At last," Emmett whispered, "let me speak to her. Let me—" A sharp knock interrupted them. Agata turned, startled, and opened the door to find Lydia Corbin standing on the landing. Her face was pale, her lips painted a cruel shade of crimson, her gloves still on, as if she had not planned to stay long. Behind her, a footman waited at the base of the steps, with a carriage door already open. "I thought I might find you here," Lydia said calmly, stepping inside without invitation. Agata's breath caught, but she did not move. Lydia looked from one to the other, her expression unreadable. Then she smiled, slow, venomous. "I've come for my veil." Agata walked to the table, picked up the lace carefully folded in linen, and handed it to her without a word. Lydia took it, then glanced at Emmett, her voice honeyed with cruelty. "Is this how you pass your afternoons, dear cousin? Whispering to the help, or are you here to have your buttons mended?" Emmett opened his mouth to speak, but Agata's voice cut through. "Miss Corbin," she said, her tone serene, "if there's anything else you require, please put it in writing." Lydia's eyes flashed. "You've played this beautifully. A few tears, a few pins, and suddenly you're at the center of every drawing-room tale in town." Agata stepped closer. "I've played nothing. I've worked, and I've kept my silence." Lydia leaned in, her voice a hiss. "You think you're better than me, because you sew, because you suffer, but you'll never wear the name. You'll never walk through our doors without a tray in your hands." Agata looked into her eyes and said nothing. She returned to the veil. In one final act, she lifted it gently, fastened it to Lydia's hair with 2 small pins, adjusted the fall over her shoulders, and smoothed the fabric down her back. It was done with the grace of a professional, the touch of a woman who had mastered her craft, and the poise of someone who would not be broken. When the veil was in place, Agata stepped back, her face calm. Lydia met her gaze, and in that moment, something shifted, an understanding, or perhaps a surrender. Lydia turned without another word, sweeping from the room like a queen from a losing kingdom. Emmett looked at Agata. "You didn't have to endure that." "Yes, I did," she said softly. "For my name, for my dignity." He reached for her hand, but she pulled away. "Go," she whispered, "before you choose something neither of us can undo." And he left, without her hand, without her forgiveness, but with something he had never known he lacked, a woman who knew her worth, and a letter that burned hotter than the fires that built his fortune. The wind changed in Bethlehem that week. It no longer carried only the weight of soot and steel, but something deeper, something more human, like the tremble of a bridge before it breaks, or the hush of a church before confession. The streets still bustled, the foundries still burned, and the bells still rang out each hour as if nothing had shifted. But those who lived beneath the shadow of the Corbin Empire felt it. Something had fractured, and it would never mend quietly. Inside the Corbin mansion, Henrik sat behind his mahogany desk like a king enthroned, a decanter of dark whiskey casting amber light across his papers. The walls were lined with ledgers and maps, not portraits. Henrik believed in legacy not as blood, but as industry. What one built mattered more than what one loved. Across from him stood Agata Kowalski, her shawl still dusted with cold, her chin lifted despite the tremor in her hands. "I know why you called me here," she said calmly. Henrik poured a drink, not bothering to offer her one. "Good, then I won't waste your time." Agata did not sit. She remained standing, her posture rigid, the letter from Tomasz folded neatly in her pocket, close to her heart. "Your father is old," Henrik began, "and ill. I imagine the boarding house has been generous, but these arrangements, they can shift quickly." Agata said nothing. "I've spoken to the landlord," he continued. "A generous man, but under contract with our mills. And as you know, our influence reaches every corner of this town." Now she looked at him, her eyes sharp and glinting with controlled fire. "You're threatening to evict my father." Henrik leaned back in his chair. "I'm giving you a choice. Keep your silence. Destroy the letter, walk away, or you and your father find yourselves on the street come spring." The room pulsed with stillness. "I've read the letter," he added, swirling the glass. "Clever of Whitcomb. Cowardly, too. I assume you've shown it to Emmett." Her silence was answer enough. Henrik set his glass down, the sound loud in the quiet. "My son is weak, Miss Kowalski. He confuses feeling with justice. He would burn down what we've built over a handful of names on a piece of paper." Agata's voice, when it came, was soft, but it cut through the air like glass. Those names had sons, wives, lives. Henrik stood, circling the desk until he was close enough to lower his voice. "You want to protect your father. Then understand this. Men like me do not lose. They wait. They wear down the world until it bends to them." She met his gaze without blinking. "Then perhaps it's time the world broke." Emmett found her outside the boarding house that evening, her shoulders tight beneath her shawl, her hands clenched in the folds of her skirt. The sun was dipping low, painting the snow a bruised violet. He had seen her leave his father's carriage. He knew. "What did he say?" he asked gently. Agata didn't look at him. "He threatened my father. He'll have him turned out if I speak." Emmett felt something unravel inside him. "Then he's gone too far." "He always has," she whispered. "You just never wanted to see it." A long silence stretched between them. Wind stirred the bare trees, and somewhere down the road, the whistle of the mill split the dusk. "I can't stay silent," Agata said. "But if I speak, my father suffers. And if I don't, someone else's will." Emmett stepped closer, his voice low. "Then let me be the one to speak. Let me do what I should have done long ago." She looked at him then, truly looked, and something fragile passed between them. Hope, perhaps, or the last light before nightfall. "Will you?" she asked, and he nodded, not because it was easy, but because he finally understood. The next morning, the press descended on Bethlehem like snow in a sudden storm. Emmett had summoned them himself. Editors from the Morning Ledger and the Philadelphia Inquirer, local reporters with stained fingers and notepads too small for truth. He stood before the main gates of the Corbin estate in his work coat, not his formal one. No tie, no gloves, just the face of a man who had nothing left to fear. "I have come to tell you the truth," he began, voice steady. "There was a fire in the south furnace. 3 men were injured, 1 died. We were warned of the faulty valve. That warning was ignored." He held up the letter, its edges worn now, its ink indelible. "This was written by Tomasz Whitcomb. He died 3 days later. My father knew. He said silence would cost less than action." The reporters scribbled, eyes wide. I have chosen, Emmett continued, to break from the Corbin enterprise. I will liquidate my shares and fund the full repairs to the mill's safety systems. I will create a relief fund for the widows. I will not be silent any longer. Gasps rippled through the crowd, but Emmett said no more. He turned and walked away, each step echoing louder than any applause. Inside the mansion, Henrik watched from the window, his hands white-knuckled around his cane. "He's finished," he growled, but no one answered. Because just then, Lydia entered the room. She was dressed for travel. No pearls, no bustle, no veil. Just a deep green coat with silver buttons and a small leather case in her hand. Her mother followed silently behind. Henrik turned. "You're leaving?" Lydia's expression was unreadable. "There's nothing left to stay for. Emmett's a fool. This will ruin us." "Then let it," Lydia said coldly. "He chose truth. And I—" Her voice wavered for the first time, then hardened. "I choose myself." She turned toward the butler waiting near the stairs. "Tell the driver we leave at once." As she passed the grand staircase, one of the maids whispered behind her hand, "She didn't shed a single tear." Another replied, "She just said she'd write her own future now." And with that, Lydia Corbin stepped out of her legacy. That night, the boarding house was quiet. The storm had passed, but the air was raw. Agata sat by the window, sewing in the half-light. Her father slept peacefully, his breathing steady. The letter now lay in a drawer beneath her sketches, its truth no longer a secret, its burden finally shared. A knock came at the door. She stood, her heart a wild, tender thing in her chest. She opened it slowly. Emmett stood there, the collar of his coat damp with melted snow, his hair disheveled. His eyes held everything. What he had lost, what he had chosen, what he still hoped for. "Agata," he said. But she said nothing. She didn't let him in. Not yet. Instead, she looked at him, long and searching, and then closed the door with quiet finality, not out of cruelty, but because dignity, once awakened, could not be rushed. And love, if it was to last, must come not in triumph, but in truth. The final frost came softly to Bethlehem, the way old grief returns, quiet, invisible at first, until it touches everything. Trees stood bare and brittle under a pearl-grey sky, and the cobblestone streets gleamed with a fine layer of silver dew. The smoke from the mills no longer felt as heavy as it once had. It rose into the sky less like a threat and more like a promise, still unsure of its voice. In the corner room of the boarding house, the warmth of the fire had become more precious than ever. Agata Kowalski sat at her small table, carefully wrapping a glass bottle of cough tincture in cloth before placing it gently in the cupboard. It had cost nearly everything she had left. Her father slept soundly in the rocking chair near the stove, a heavy cardigan wrapped around his thin shoulders, the blanket tucked around his legs embroidered with fading blue roses. His breathing was slower now, more labored but steady. Each breath was a small victory. Agata turned to the ledger beside the bottle. The numbers barely added up. Rent for the next month, a smaller room with fewer stairs, 3 days' worth of food. She exhaled and rubbed her temple. There would be no indulgences, no new fabric, no ribbons, only thread. And yet, there was still work. Always work. At dawn, she opened the modest storefront that a friend from the Tailors' Guild had offered her, a corner shop on the edge of the market square, long abandoned with a creaking door and dusty windows. With her own hands, she had scrubbed the walls, stitched a curtain from scraps, and painted a wooden sign that read simply, "Kowalski Dressmaking and Repair." The name felt like both a rebellion and a prayer. By mid-morning, the bell over the door rang for the first time. It was Mrs. Whitcomb. She came with a quiet smile, a wool shawl over her head, and a young girl at her side, her niece, thin and wide-eyed, holding a bundle of faded muslin. "She's starting school next month," the widow said softly, "but the dress is too short. Would you—" Agata knelt beside the girl, her tape measure already around her neck. "Of course," she said gently. We'll let the hem down, and I'll give it a bit of lace, something borrowed from a happier dress. By noon, 2 more customers arrived, a laundress with calloused hands and a church widow with a child's apron torn at the pocket. Then came the unexpected. A carriage rolled to a stop outside, sleek, polished, and far too grand for the street. Agata looked up from her needle as the bell rang again. A woman stepped inside, not young, not rich, but elegant in the way of someone who had once been both. Her gloves were pale cream, her coat a shade of plum usually reserved for cathedral pews. She held herself with a dignified calm. "I heard your hands are steadier than most," she said, "and that your stitches tell the truth." Agata blinked. "You heard correctly." The woman smiled. "Then I'd like to commission a new collar for a silk blouse, and perhaps, if your time allows, a ribbon for an old bonnet I can no longer afford to replace." Agata nodded, her chest swelling with something she hadn't let herself feel in weeks: gratitude. By the end of the day, the counter was full of small commissions, nothing extravagant, nothing gilded, but real, honest, and hers. That night, she returned home with sore hands and a tired body. Her father, wrapped in his heavy cardigan, sat by the window, watching the street below. As she entered, he did not turn, but he spoke in Polish, softly, almost reverently. "Twoja matka byłaby dumna." Your mother would be proud. Agata's breath caught in her throat. She set down her basket and went to him, kneeling by his chair. He took her hand and patted it weakly. "I saw you," he whispered, "with the little girl, taking her measurements. You looked just like her." Agata leaned her head against his knee, tears warming her cheeks. "I don't feel like her." "You are," he said. "You've carried more than we ever asked. And still, you stand." They sat like that for a long time, silence knitting itself around them like a shawl made of memory and endurance. On the other side of town, the Corbin mills were no longer running at full capacity. The south furnace had been shut down entirely, and crews worked day and night to repair its cracked foundation. Emmett Corbin, no longer dressed in tailored suits or escorted by foremen, worked beside the labourers. His gloves were worn, his back sore, his hands blistered, but he did not complain. He rose with the first bell, ate with the crews, and slept in a narrow room above the engineer's office, lit only by a kerosene lamp and warmed by a stove that hissed and coughed. At first, the workers had watched him with suspicion, then with curiosity, and finally with something like respect. They saw the heir of steel carrying buckets of water, lifting beams, kneeling in ash to inspect cooling valves. He spoke little, but when he did, his words were measured, thoughtful, real. He never mentioned his father. He never asked about Lydia. But sometimes, when the wind was quiet and the sky softened into dusk, he would pull a folded piece of fabric from his pocket, a scrap of ivory satin frayed at the edges, with golden thread tangled in its corner, and he would press it gently between his palms, as if holding something too fragile to name. One Sunday morning, the bell over Agata's shop rang long before opening hours. She opened the door to find a row of women waiting, some with mending in hand, others with little more than hope in their eyes. Word had spread, not about her scandal, but about her skill and her silence. Among them were women from every corner of Bethlehem, millwives, bakers' daughters, the mistress of a retired judge. They stood shoulder to shoulder beneath the sign that bore her name. That afternoon, Agata took her lunch by the open window, the sound of laughter drifting up from the market below. She sipped weak tea and let the sunlight touch her face. For the first time in months, she felt the ache inside her quiet. Not healed, not gone, but quiet. And that, for now, was enough. At dusk, as she gathered her things to return home, a package was delivered to her shop with no note. Inside was a new pair of shears, made of tempered steel, polished until they shone like silver. On the handle, engraved in careful script, was a single word, Kowalski. Agata traced the letters with her fingertips, and though no one stood beside her, she felt a presence as surely as if someone had whispered her name. She held the shears for a long moment, then set them gently beside her oldest needle, steel and thread, inheritance and resilience, and a heart that, though threadbare, had never stopped beating. The morning arrived shrouded in the delicate hush of early spring, when the river's edge began to thaw and the black trees shed their icy armor. It was the kind of day Bethlehem rarely offered, neither bleak nor celebratory, but something gentler, something expectant. Along the narrow street just beyond the market square, the air smelled faintly of damp earth and warmed stone, and the scent mingled with the starch of pressed linen and a trace of lavender water rising from the open door of Kowalski dressmaking and repair. Agata stood in the back room, her hands motionless above the ivory folds of Lydia Corbin's abandoned wedding gown. It rested atop the sewing table like a ghost without purpose. A note, folded and pressed flat as if to remove any trace of sentiment, lay beside it. Finish it however you please. No name, no explanation. But Agata did not need one. The gown was pristine, untouched by altar light or bridal perfume. The silk shimmered like moonlight, its lines flawless, but stitched across the bodice, perfectly centered, defiantly proud, was the embroidered crest of the Corbin family, 2 forged hammers crossed beneath a steel crown. Agata had spent 3 days embroidering that crest by candlelight. Her fingers had cramped, her eyes had blurred. She remembered pausing midway through the goldwork, her heart weighted with a bitterness she could not name, only to continue because she had no choice. Now she did. She took her seam ripper and pierced the first golden thread. The sound of it tearing was soft, almost reverent, like undoing a lie too long believed. One by one the threads came loose, their legacy falling to the floor in a quiet heap. And when the crest was gone, what remained was not emptiness, but freedom. Agata reached for a fresh skein of thread, green the color of new branches, and sketched gently with chalk, not a crown, not hammers, but a tree. Simple, steady, its roots curling downward, its limbs reaching skyward, as if to embrace a future not yet written. She threaded her needle and began. The doorbell chimed, its sound clear and delicate. Agata did not look up at first, but then she heard a voice she had not expected to hear again. "I brought eggs," said Mrs. Whitcomb, stepping inside with her shawl drawn tight and her son beside her, a tall boy with soot along his sleeves and honest dirt beneath his fingernails. Agata rose from her stool, her lips parting in surprise. "He's working the upper floor now," Mrs. Whitcomb said proudly. "No more broken rails, no more rusted valves." The boy said nothing, only nodded once with the seriousness of a man who had seen too much for his years. Mrs. Whitcomb handed over the basket. "Some things can't be repaid," she said, her voice trembling, "but they can be honored." Agata blinked back the heat behind her eyes. "You didn't have to—" "I did," the widow interrupted gently, "because you didn't wait for someone else to do the right thing." She glanced at the half-finished embroidery on the gown and smiled, just barely. "It suits you," she added, "that tree." And then she left. Alone again, Agata sat slowly, her hands returning to the thread. Her fingers moved with practiced ease, but her breath was uneven. It was not sorrow that gripped her, nor anger. It was something quieter, something like peace. But she did not trust it, not yet. The last light of afternoon slanted through the window, painting her workspace in a soft golden haze. She did not hear the door open again, nor the footsteps that followed. Only when the warmth of his shadow touched the floor at her feet did she raise her head. Emmett Corbin stood there, hat in hand, the wind tugging at the hem of his coat. He looked thinner, his features sharper than she remembered, but his eyes— those storm-grey eyes held no uncertainty now, no doubt. He did not smile. "I heard the gown was returned," he said softly. Agata folded her hands in her lap. "Yes." She gave it back without a word. "She gave it back with permission," Agata corrected. "That's more than most women ever get." He stepped closer, but not too close. His posture was careful, reverent. "I walked to the river this morning," he said, "where the workers used to unload iron. The docks are gone, but I remembered the sound the chains made. Your father told me once that his back never stopped aching after the flood of '81. "He told me that too," she murmured, surprised he had remembered. There was silence then, but not coldness. "I've thought of 100 things I could bring you," Emmett said. "Letters, books, flowers, keys to a house not yet built." He paused. "But all I have is a question." Agata looked up. He knelt, not as a man making a grand gesture, but as someone who knew what it meant to meet another where they were as they were. "If I build something from nothing," he said, his voice rough with truth, "not steel or mansions, but something worth waking for, would you walk beside me, no matter how long the road?" Her breath caught, not because she had not hoped for those words, but because for the first time she believed them. She rose slowly and met him eye to eye. "I will," she said, "as long as it's not a path someone else drew for us." His smile came then, slow, sure, breaking like sun through frost. "No," he said. "It'll be ours, every stone of it." They stood like that, not touching, not needing to. The silence between them was no longer full of longing, but of understanding. And in the quiet hum of that sewing room, with the unfinished gowns still waiting on the table, something ancient and new took root. Later, she would finish the embroidery. Later, she would light the lamp and lock the door and turn the gown into something else entirely. But for now, she simply let him hold her gaze. And for once, that was enough. It was late May in Bethlehem, and for the first time in recent memory, the sky did not hang with soot. The mills still churned, their great lungs exhaling smoke over the rooftops, but the air was gentler now. The clang of iron was no longer the only sound that shaped the rhythm of the streets. There were other notes, children's laughter, hammer against wood, chalk on slate. Life had not softened, but it had steadied. In the old stone church on the hill, morning light poured through panes of coloured glass, scattering reds and blues onto the worn floorboards and over the shoulders of those gathered. No musicians played, no bells rang, but there was a hush, reverent and warm, as every seat filled, not with society's elite, but with people whose hands bore the marks of labour and whose eyes had seen sorrow, fire, and the beginning of something new. At the back of the church, the doors opened, and there she stood. Agata Kowalski wore no veil. Her dress was pale linen, stitched by her own hands, plain in shape, but kissed with a border of golden thread along the hem. The thread caught the light like sunrise at her feet. Her hair was pinned low, a single braid wound like ribbon across the back of her head. She carried no bouquet, only a steady breath. The guests rose. At the front pew, Mr. Kowalski lifted his head. His shoulders were thinner now, the cane at his side a constant companion, but he sat straight, proud. As his daughter stepped into the aisle, he raised his hands and clapped once. Then again. The sound was soft, but sure. Others joined him. The applause grew, not raucous, but full of warmth and reverence. Agata's steps did not falter, but her eyes, bright with something tender, lingered on her father as she passed. Waiting at the altar stood Emmett. He wore a simple black coat, clean and pressed, his hair neatly combed back. No cravat, no crest. He had refused every symbol of his name. When asked how he wished to be announced, he had replied only, "As a man marrying the woman who stood when others bowed." As Agata reached him, he held out his hand, not to claim but to offer. She took it. The officiant spoke words that no one would recall verbatim. The vows were brief. There were no rings. But when they turned to face one another and said, "I will," something passed between them, far older than law and far deeper than ceremony. When the kiss came, it was gentle. No performance, only a seal. Outside the church, spring had settled over the hills like a soft shawl. Along the riverbanks, the trees bloomed in uneven bursts, their branches heavy with promise. A handful of guests stood beneath the new leaves, sharing sweet bread and stories. No carriages waited, no orchestras played. But smiles lingered long, and laughter rippled easily. From the path near the hilltop, Lydia Corbin stood in travelling attire, her gloved hands clasped neatly at her waist. Her mother stood beside her, dabbing her eyes with a handkerchief embroidered with violets. Lydia did not cry. She looked toward the church, where her cousin and the woman who had once hemmed her gowns stood among the workers, bathed in sunlight. For a long moment, she said nothing. Then she nodded, once sharply, and turned toward the carriage that would take her to New York. She didn't shed a single tear, a servant whispered nearby. Only said she'd write her own future from now on. At the edge of town, in a manor house built of stone and memory, Emmett Corbin sat alone in a room lined with ledgers and oil portraits. The morning newspaper lay open in his lap, the headline quiet but clear. Corbin heir marries local seamstress. New Bethlehem fund. Continues. Expansion. Henrik's eyes lingered on the column for a moment. Then, without comment, he folded the paper once, then again. The silver handle of his cane caught the firelight as he leaned back in his chair. The flame crackled, but he said nothing. Weeks passed. Agata and Emmett moved into a modest house near the edge of the boarding house district. Not far, but far enough to breathe differently. The parlour doubled as a sewing room. The back window faced the churchyard. Mr. Kowalski spent many afternoons seated beside that window, wrapped in his heavy cardigan, watching girls in cotton dresses carry baskets of chalk and scrap fabric to the newly opened sewing school. It was Agata's idea. A place for young girls to learn not just stitching and seams, but numbers and letters. She hired a widow to teach the arithmetic, and a former mill hand with a crooked back to read aloud during breaks. No girl was turned away. Some wore bonnets tied with silk ribbons. Others arrived barefoot. All sat at the same wooden benches. Emmett helped lay the school's foundation with his own hands. Each board nailed into place was a small defiance against everything he had inherited and chosen to relinquish. The men in town began to nod to him with something like respect, not because he was a Corbin, but because he no longer wished to be. One afternoon, as the light poured through the sewing school's windows, Agata stood by a young girl, threading a needle for the first time. The child's brow furrowed, her small fingers trembling. Agata leaned in gently. "Not too tight," she whispered. "Let it glide." The girl smiled. The thread passed cleanly through. And outside, Bethlehem's forge continued to burn, but it no longer ruled. It warmed. In the quiet of a world rebuilt, love held fast, not with grandeur, not with thunder, but with every stitch sewn in truth and every step taken side by side. Bethlehem, spring of 1890. The river still sang, though its voice had softened. Its banks, once blackened with coal dust and soot, now shimmered with wildflowers. Children's laughter echoed through alleyways where silence once brooded. The mills still pulsed with life, but they no longer owned the rhythm of the town. They shared it. In a sun-drenched room above the sewing school, Agata stood by the window, her sewing basket resting untouched beside her. A small hand tugged at her skirt. "Mama, is the dress ready yet?" "Almost, Zosha," she answered, crouching to meet her daughter's bright grey eyes. "But you mustn't grow impatient. You know every stitch has a reason." The little girl nodded solemnly, clutching a doll dressed in scraps of golden-threaded linen. Her curls were a cascade of brown gold, unruly and sun-warmed. She had Emmett's quiet gaze and Agata's fire beneath it. In the garden below, Emmett knelt beside a row of new seedlings, sleeves rolled to the elbow, dirt under his nails and sweat darkening the back of his shirt. He looked up as laughter spilled from the open window, and when Agata waved, he smiled, wider now than he had ever allowed himself in youth. Not because life had grown easy, but because it had grown honest. They had not become wealthy, but they had become whole. After their wedding, Emmett had refused every offer to return to his father's world. When the final mill under Corbin Steele's name filed for reorganization 2 years later, it made headlines from Philadelphia to Pittsburgh. Some called it a tragedy, others called it justice. Emmett Corbin remained in Bethlehem until the day of his death, alone. His will, unopened by family, left the estate to a foundation no one had heard of. A last act, neither cruel nor kind, only final. The manor stood empty now, its gates rusted, ivy overtaking the walls. Lydia's letters arrived twice a year, each penned on embossed paper from a boarding school she helped fund in Manhattan. She had married a newspaper editor who encouraged her to write under her own name. Her essays, often sharp and elegant, stirred talk in parlors far beyond the Hudson. She never returned to Bethlehem, but once she sent Zosia a box of paints and a note that simply read, "For the stories she will tell." Mr. Kowalski passed quietly the previous winter, seated in his favorite chair by the window, his wool cardigan pulled snug around his shoulders. He had lived long enough to meet his granddaughter and teach her how to count stitches in Polish. His cane still leaned against the doorway, untouched, a silent reminder of the road walked and endured. The sewing school had tripled in size. Now it occupied the former office building of Corbin Steele. Emmett had insisted on repurposing the structure, not to erase its past, but to transform it. Girls came from nearby towns to learn not only tailoring and math, but how to draft letters, read contracts, and speak with conviction. Agata's teachings had changed too. Her voice held more steel now, not harsh, but sure. Some evenings, when the lamplight flickered low and Zosia was asleep with her doll tucked beneath her arm, Emmett would find Agata still awake, sketching patterns or mending a hem for someone who could not pay. "You never rest," he would whisper, brushing his fingers against hers. "Neither do you," she would answer, leaning into his shoulder. They didn't speak of fate or destiny, or what might have been had choices turned crueler. They only spoke of today, of roots, of thread that held even after storms had tried to snap it. Love had not come to them in grand declarations or stolen moments. It had arrived as something quieter, fiercer. It had survived disgrace, labor, fire, and silence. It had been tested by every cruelty of the world that believed people belonged to names and fortunes, and still it endured. In Bethlehem, when people spoke of the Corbins, they no longer mentioned steel or scandal. They said, "There was a man who gave up a crown to build a school." They said, "There was a woman who stitched history from ash and thread." And sometimes when the wind shifted and the light turned gold, they said, "There was a love here, and it did not break. Not even time could undo it." Sometimes love does not arrive in grand gestures or sweeping declarations. Sometimes it is sown quietly, patiently, into the very fabric of our days. Agata and Emmett's journey reminds us that the strongest bonds are not forged in luxury but in truth. That dignity can bloom in the humblest of homes, and that courage often wears the face of a woman with needle and thread in hand. This story is not only about a seamstress and a steel heir, it is about all of us who have stood at the edge of uncertainty and chosen love over fear, integrity over silence, and hope over history. If this story touched you, moved you, or stayed with you in some small way, I invite you to write the word thread in the comments below. That one word tells us you walked every step with Agata and Emmett, and it helps others find this story too. If you feel inspired to support the team that brings these emotional, historical romances to life, you can send a super thanks here on YouTube in whatever amount feels right to you. Every gesture of gratitude helps us continue weaving stories that matter. And if supporting financially isn't possible right now, simply share this video with someone who loves a good love story, because stories like this one are meant to be passed from hand to hand, heart to heart. Don't forget to explore the other romances waiting for you here. We've linked them in the cards at the end of this video. Stories of strength, resilience, forbidden love, and second chances. each one stitched with the same care, the same passion. Thank you for being here, for believing in love that endures, and for keeping the thread alive.